Rancher lived alone for years, until he saved two freezing baby Bigfoots. A blizzard pressed against the old cabin when a sound slipped through the wind, thin, frightened, almost a child's. The rancher, Jace Walker, stepped into the white roar and found two small shapes huddled in the drift. Not human, yet helpless. Inside by the fire, their shaking eased. Tiny hands clutched his coat as warmth returned. At dawn, the storm fell quiet. Beyond the frosted glass, the clearing stood full dozens of towering figures, breath rising like smoke. Jace opened the door and met the leader's eyes. No growl, no threat, only a question. He carried the little ones to the snow. Two gentle giants came forward and gathered them close. No words, only a rumble deep as gratitude. When the woods emptied, a smoothed branch lay on the step, silent proof that kindness had been seen. Before we begin, take a moment to comment the name of your city. Where are you watching from tonight? And when the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Welcome to the only channel that blends Western cinema myth and emotional healing in a slow, steady voice, keeping you on edge while easing you toward sleep. A lone rancher meets creatures and fate in the wild. Each twist moves from danger to mercy, then leaves a quiet peace for the night. A storm hammers the high plains. Wind howls across a wooden roof. A lantern throws gold across rough boards. Inside the isolated cabin, Jace Walker listens and hears it, a thin, thread-like cry stitched into the blizzard. He lifts the lantern, opens the door. Under the eaves, two small, fur-matted shapes curl together, trembling, breath shallow. Fear stalls him. Compassion answers. Jace gathers them in, lays them by the fire tuck's wool blankets, tight tips warm water to their lips. Then the moment that grips the heart, a tiny, five-fingered hand clutches his sleeve, no words, only pleading. The room falls quiet. You can hear Jace's heartbeat under the crackle of flame. He looks up to the frosted window stops. Beyond the glass, dozens of towering silhouettes stand in perfect silence, breath steaming in the dawn. Cut. Part 1. Warmth and a silent vow. The cabin held the storm at arm's length. Wind clawed the eaves, but inside the walls the air was tender and gold. Fire cracked in the small iron stove, each pop laying another layer of warmth across the damp floorboards. Meltwater bled from the little creature's fur, beading and dripping onto a rag Jace had spread near the hearth. He worked without hurry, the way a man does when haste breaks delicate things. He wiped snow from their tiny shoulders, from their brows and lashes. The two of them huddled close, breathing shallow, heat-shocked and shivering. Their fur was matted into cords. Their hands, five-fingered broad in the palm, but small as any child's, clutched the cuff of his coat with a strength born of fear. Jace tore a loaf into soft pieces, cupped each bit with a palmful of warm water until it went sponge-light, and held it to their mouths. They sniffed unsure, then nibbled, then ate with a hesitant urgency, as if this warmth might be a trick that could vanish. "Easy," he murmured. "You're safe here." The words misted in the lantern light, not just for them. He needed to hear them too. For years he had filled this single room with nothing but chores and quiet. Coffee on before dawn. Tack mended by lamplight. A cot in the corner where Boots slept beneath the blanket. His world had narrowed to things that couldn't leave. And yet now there were two fragile lives asking him without language to widen it again. He lifted a tin cup to their lips, one after the other, tipping careful sips of warm water. Their tremors eased as the heat went in. The nearest one, smaller by a handspan, leaned against his knee, as if he were an old stump, winter-sound and trustworthy. The larger kept watch with glossy eyes, tracking his face, the door, the fire back to his face. Their breaths lengthened and synced to the stove's hush, a slow, windy rhythm, a lullaby built from survival. Jace's hands remembered another winter, another mouth to warm. A flash, quick and cruel, cut across the present, a boy's mitten left on a fence post. A cough that rattled like a loose hinge. A fever that climbed as snow fell silent and unhelpful. He had held that little weight and listened for breath that would not come back. After that, his house learned the shape of absence. Folks said he'd chosen solitude. He knew solitude had chosen him. Tonight, standing on that same floor, he felt the old ache step through his ribs and sit down. Not tonight, he told the fire, barely moving his lips. No one dies to the storm tonight. The vow landed in the room like a third log, shifting everything warmer. He tucked the wool blankets tighter around the little ones, rubbing their arms through the fabric until heat returned to the skin beneath. Their fingers loosened. One blinked, slow and heavy lashes sticking, then pressed the back of its hand against his wrist, the way children test for presence in the dark. Jace covered that hand with his own, steady and open, and the question inside those eyes dimmed to a manageable glow. Outside, the gale ebbed a measure. Wind went from knife to thread. Between gusts, the cabin breathed. Jace listened as men like him are born to listen past the obvious. Somewhere in the seams of the weather, he caught a hollow note soft as a knuckle on an empty barrel. He stilled. The tap came again, barely there, a polite sound that didn't belong to storm or animal. He rose, moving so the blankets wouldn't slip. He set the cup down, took the lantern, and crossed the room. At the door, he paused, feeling the old reflex gather, the one that says, bar it, nail it, pretend the world ends at wood and iron. But the same quiet that had guided his hands all night pushed him forward. He lifted the latch and cracked the door. Cold slid in thin and testing. Snow ticked the threshold. On the top step, the storm had laid a delicate drift, and then atop that, someone had laid a slender branch, clean smoothed at the ends as if worry had worn it. No footprints remained to explain it. Wind had combed the porch to blankness, only the branch resting as deliberately as a letter on a table. Jace didn't step out. He didn't call. He knew when a message wanted to be read with the eyes, not the voice. He knelt in the doorway, lifted the lantern, and tilted the light. The wood had a faint mark carved near one tip, a shallow groove, a teardrop shape no longer than a thumbnail. He couldn't name it, but every part of him understood it the way a horse understands a raised hand. This was notice. This was, we know. He set the branch gently on the inner sill, closed the door, and wedged the latch. The stove's glow rolled back over the room like a blanket someone had slipped from his shoulders and now draped again with care. The little ones blinked up, waiting to learn from his face whether the world had changed shape. He let his jaw unclench, softened his gaze, and sat beside them. "You're safe here." He repeated the words deeper now. He tore another piece of bread, wet it, fed the bigger one first, then the smaller, and watched their chests rise in calmer arcs. The smaller one edged closer and tucked its hand under his palm to palm as if matching its pulse to his could anchor it to the warm side of living. It worked. The shiver drained away, leaving a looseness in the limbs that only comes when a body stops negotiating with cold. The storm tried once more to remind them who ruled the valley. A long gust leaned its weight against the cabin and sighed down the stovepipe. The flame answered with a stubborn crackle. Jace's eyes wandered to the branch on the sill, to the tiny carved teardrop glinting like a vowel from a language he could almost speak. He did not know their words, but he understood their courtesy. A request had been made without trespass. "Let ours be warm, then we will take them home." He reached for another blanket and eased it over the two small shapes, leaving their faces free to drink firelight. He pulled his chair closer, not to watch over them like a guard, but to keep them company like a neighbor. He settled his elbows on his knees and let his breathing settle until it matched theirs. The room answered with its own music embers, shifting a board ticking as it dried the feathered hush of snow slipping off the eaves. "Not tonight," he said again, this time to the boy he couldn't save, and to the strangers he could. "Not on my watch." Something unclenched in the air. It wasn't triumph, storms aren't beaten, only outlasted, but it was a small victory of warmth over distance. Jace thought of the branch and the mark and the unseen eyes in the timberline. He pictured a circle of great shapes waiting in patience that humans rarely manage. He didn't feel hunted. He felt included in a ceremony he hadn't known he could enter, a trade of trust conducted entirely in silence. He leaned back, the chair creaking, and watched the two little chests rise and fall in the push and pull of sleep. Firelight walked across the ceiling. Beyond the door, he could almost sense the forest taking the measure of the cabin, counting breaths, counting kindness. If there was a ledger in this country, he hoped he'd tilted it a fraction toward mercy. The wind softened further, tattered into stray threads that the dark gathered in. Jace lifted the tin cup, warmed more water, and let it steam between his hands. The night no longer felt endless. It felt kept. And inside that keptness, a vow glowed with the stubborn heat of coals. They had come close to dying in the snow, but not in his house, not under his roof, not while his hands still knew how to hold on. Part 2. Gray Dawn and the Silent Tribe. Dawn arrived without color, a gray that felt like breath held in the throat of the world. Frost webbed the inside of the window. Each pane wore a pale bloom where night had pressed its face and stayed. The pines beyond the glass stood locked in unmoving shoulders loaded with white. Even the wind seemed to have spent itself and gone somewhere else to rest. Jace woke before the light decided to be day. He rose from the chair with the slow care of a man who didn't want to jar the small miracle sleeping by the stove. The two little ones lay nested in wool, their fur drying to soft clumps, their chests lifting in steady, almost synchronized arcs. He adjusted a blanket edge, let his knuckles graze a warm temple, and then he listened beyond the stove's hush, beyond the drip of meltwater toward the door. There is a silence that means safety, and another that means attention. This was the second kind. He took the lantern, though he barely needed it now, and walked to the door. The branch with the carved teardrop lay where he'd set it on the sill, a quiet witness. He drew a breath, felt it cloud and fade, and lifted the latch. The door swung to a gray so thick it seemed to have weight. Cold came first, tidy and complete. Then shape, then scale. The clearing was full of bodies, tall, fur dark, outlined in frost. They stood in a wide ring that left the cabin a small, bright island. No one moved. No one spoke. Their breath rose in plumes that built and thinned and built again, the only movement in that arrested morning. One stepped forward. He was the height of the door, and then some close to 8 feet shoulders, broad chest, deep. Frost had sugared the hair along his arms and beard, and where his breath met the air it made a soft engine sound, steady and resonant. He stopped a few paces from the bottom step. Jace did not retreat. He planted his boots where the floorboards ended and the world began, and let his arms hang open to show they were empty. The leader's eyes held a kind of weather-heavy, experienced measuring. He took Jace in the way old trees take in a storm, without hurry, without flinch. Then slowly, those eyes slid past Jace's shoulder toward the orange shimmer that folded around the two small shapes by the fire. It was not hunger in the glance, not threat. It was inventory. It was care performing its own count. Jace felt the pull to cross his arms, to put something between his chest and that gaze. Instead, he let himself stay unarmored. He matched his breathing to the leader's visible exhale, let the rhythm steady him. When he spoke, he kept his voice low so it would sit properly in the quiet. "They're warm," he said. "They made it." The leader didn't shift. Not a muscle. But something in the pace of his breath altered, one long measured plume, then another, as if attention had accepted its answer, and moved a fraction aside. Behind him, the tribe remained arranged in their circle, a circumference of patience. Snow clung to forearms and shoulders like epaulets. Icicles threaded some of their beards. No eyes wandered, no feet shuffled. It looked less like a standoff than a ceremony. Jace felt his own ceremony wake up inside him. He stepped backward once, a small gesture of room-making, then turned toward the hearth. The little ones blinked, roused by the door's open draft. When they saw the gray world waiting, they made the smallest sounds, more breath than voice, and reached with both hands toward the light beyond Jace. "All right," he said softly. "Let's do this right." He slid an arm under each small body, gathering them as if they were made of the same wool that wrapped them. They were heavier than they looked, the way living things are, solid with the stubborn fact of warmth. The smaller tucked its face against his collarbone. The larger hooked an arm around his neck and held on. Jace walked to the door and paused, letting the first slice of cold strike his cheeks, letting the little ones feel it and decide not to be afraid. Then he stepped onto the porch. Snow gave under his boots with a sound like sighing sand. The tribe did not advance. The leader, Elder Ash Jace, named him without knowing why, took a single step nearer enough to own his place as the one who would witness what came next. His breath clouded in slow, controlled bursts. Jace could hear it now, the bass of it like wind at the mouth of a cave tempered and deep. It filled the space where fear might have gone. Jace crouched the wool blanket skimming the porch boards. He set the larger of the two down first, steadying it by the shoulders until the legs remembered weight. Then the smaller who stood and immediately leaned into his knee for an extra heartbeat of courage. Both faced the tribe. Both lifted their hands. The sound they made, thin, unpracticed, hopeful, went across the clearing like a thread tossed to catch. From the wide ring, two adults detached themselves and approached at a pace that honored the hush. They were shorter than Elder Ash by a head, broad through the chest movements tuned to gentleness. When they reached the first step, they lowered themselves, knees bent, backs, rounded eyes dipped until their faces sat level with the little one's eyes. Jace felt his throat thicken. The gesture was unmistakable gratitude rendered as posture. The larger of the two small ones reached first, a palm landing on the adult's forearm as if testing stone warmed by sun. The adult answered with a rumble, not a growl, more like a note hummed into an empty room. The smaller slid sideways and pressed itself into the crook of the other adult's arm. Wool, fur, breath, and relief stitched together into a single shape called home. Jace rose but did not step back yet. He let the moment belong to them while still standing close enough to lend steadiness if a leg faltered. Elder Ash watched with the grave attention of someone counting blessings one by one. Then he lifted his chin by a degree the smallest permission. The two adults stood gathering the little ones fully against their chests. Snow shed from their shoulders in soft sloughs. One turned enough to look at Jace, and though the face wasn't built for human smiles, the eyes carried the contour of thanks. The bass note returned deeper, now joined by a second and a third from the circle tones that layered, rather than competed, a chord built of breath and restraint. Jace let his hands fall open at his sides. He felt the exact instant trust replaced fear in his body, a looseness at the base of his neck, a warmth uncurling behind the sternum. He had not been tested. He had been invited to keep a promise, and he had kept it. The tribe did not surge or scatter. They shifted as one organism does when it remembers its next motion. Elder Ash held his ground long enough to meet Jace's eyes again. Close up, Jace could see the frost melted in a halo. Where heat kept its own territory, could see a faint scar along the cheek, a story Jace would never be told. The leader dipped his head once slow. It was not a bow. It was recognition. Jace echoed the motion, equal parts reverence and relief. The cold gnawed at his ears. He did not notice. He stepped back to the threshold, then a sign that his part of the ritual had ended. The two adults pivoted, placing their bodies between the little ones and the wind, and walked toward the ring. The circle opened for them without sound, the way a lake opens when a boat noses through. The chord of breath faded to its bass tone again. For a long second, no one moved beyond that. The morning held its gray. The pines kept their counsel. The cabin's fire sent one last lick of gold over the porch boards, and Jace could feel behind him the quiet of a room that had done holy work. Elder Ash turned at last, and the tribe flowed with him into the trees. No haste, no glance over the shoulder, no footprint too deep to survive the next wind. In their wake, the clearing felt larger, the air somehow cleaner, as if a weight had lifted without ever pressing. Jace stood with his palm on the doorframe, not to steady himself, but to honor the wood that had framed a fragile piece. He looked down at the carved branch on the sill, and in it he heard the grammar of this morning patience as subject mercy, as verb return, as object. When he closed the door, the latch clicked like the period at the end of a sentence he'd spent years learning how to write. Part 3, The Return and the Token of Thanks. The porch held a skin of snow so fine it looked poured rather than fallen. Morning peeled itself out of night in shades of blue, pale at the horizon, deeper under the cabin's eaves, almost silver where the wind had polished the drifts smooth. The timberline beyond stood crowded and dark, every bough loaded as if winter had laid its full hand there and refused to lift it. Jace crouched and eased the little ones down onto the soft crust, guiding their feet until the snow accepted their weight. Blankets brushed the boards. Wool whispered against wood. He kept a palm at each small back for a breath longer than necessary, the way a man does when his body needs assurance his mind can't yet supply. Then he let go. From the wide ring of silhouettes, two adults stepped forward, not with the rigid caution of a guard, but with the deliberate care of kin. They moved through the thin light as if not to bruise it. When they reached the bottom step, they slowed, and a sound rose in the tribe in the air and the chest, low and sustained like the first note of a song tuned to the earth. It carried no edge. It asked nothing. It thanked. The larger small one reached first, pressing a palm 5 sure fingers into the furred forearm, waiting for it. The adult shifted just enough to meet that trust with steadiness. The smaller took one last look at Jace as if committing the shape of his face to the private gallery where saved moments are kept, then tucked itself into the crook of the other adult's arm. Fur and wool met and mingled. Breath found a matched rhythm and dismissed the night's cold as old business. Jace stood. He didn't back away. Not yet. He let the reality of the return finish writing itself in the snow between them. Around the clearing, the circle of giants held their places, each figure a column of patience. The bass note swelled and softened, deepening the quiet rather than disturbing it. He felt it in his ribs, that resonance, felt it soften the hard edge of the memory he carried and turn sharp grief into a smoother ache he could carry without bleeding. A single figure left the ring. Smaller than Elder Ash by a shoulder, broad through the chest, this one approached at an angle of respect, eyes lowered, hands empty and open. When they reached the bottom step, they didn't climb. Instead, they bent and laid an object on the first board. No flourish, no lingering, a simple placing of a simple thing exactly where it would be seen. Jace looked down. A slender branch, its bark long ago rubbed away to a satin plainness, lay straight across the step. One end had been worried into a smooth taper. Near that tip, a shallow teardrop was carved, a single clean groove, no larger than a thumbnail. The mark caught the morning like a glint of thought. Elder Ash stepped forward now, not to deliver, but to witness the delivery. He stood square to Jace, breath pluming in measured drafts, gaze steady as weathered timber. No words existed that both could share. None were needed. Jace lowered his head in a nod small enough to honor the hush and large enough to be seen. Elder Ash answered with the slowest tilt, a fraction of a bow that acknowledged the exchange, warmth given. Warmth returned. Fear held in check, fear released. The two adults gathered the little ones fully to their chests. Snow shook free in soft flurries as they turned back toward the ring. The tribe made room without the language of orders. Space opened as if a thought had traveled faster than sight. The bass note dipped, grew richer with a second tone folded underneath a harmony made of breath alone. In that chord, Jace heard an old grammar he could almost translate, "You kept our fire. We keep your peace." They began to leave. Not all at once, not in a rush, not like smoke ripped by a gust, more like mist, stepping backward into trees it had known all its life. Big bodies moved with quiet he would have called impossible yesterday. Footfalls pressed soft ellipses into the crust, and even those marks seemed reluctant to burden the ground. The clearing widened as the ring retreated. The light grew roomier. The silence somehow warmed. Elder Ash remained for the last look. He turned his face to the cabin, to the thin trail of lamp-thrown gold along the sill, to the smolder that stitched the room together behind Jace's shoulder. Then those depth-dark eyes returned to Jace. They held for a beat that made time feel intentional, then released. Elder Ash pivoted and followed his people into the timberline, vanishing one stride at a time until the forest re-stitched itself, and only the suggestion of size lingered between the pines. Jace didn't chase the sight. He let absence finish the sentence. Snow sifted from a burdened branch at the edge of the clearing and landed without sound. The air had the blankness that follows prayer. He looked down at the token. The branch lay where it had been, set thin as a promise and twice as steady. He bent and lifted it with both hands, not because it was heavy, but because it asked to be handled as if it mattered. Up close, the teardrop cut showed tool marks that weren't crude so much as careful, like something shaped over hours by repetition and attention rather than by force. The smoothness along the length told a story of worry, maybe, or of passing hand to hand through long winters. Its simplicity refused ornament, its meaning refused doubt. Noam, he said under his breath, borrowing words he'd heard from traders long ago, the debt of warmth. The phrase fit the branch the way the groove fit the grain. He raised it to chest height and held it there against the place the cold goes first. It wasn't a trophy. It wasn't proof. It was an exchange made visible, a receipt written in wood. Behind him, the stove exhaled a soft shift of heat. He felt the cabin at his back like a companion old scarred still game for keeping life close. The porch boards under his boots knew every weight he'd carried, and they took this thin carved vow as if it belonged. He thought of all the years he'd spent trading his loneliness for work, mending fence-boiling coffee, sleeping with his boots within reach of his hand. Those bargains had kept him alive but not connected. This morning had offered a different trade solitude for gratitude, not to cancel the first, but to soften it. He understood standing there with the branch pressed to his shirt that the night's vow had been answered, and in the answering another vow had been made, one he hadn't spoken but now recognized. Keep the quiet. Guard the boundary. Remember who came in need and who returned in thanks. He glanced at the snowfield. Where the tribe had passed, the prints already began to blur, the wind working gently at the edges, as if the world preferred mystery to evidence. If any posse came asking, they'd find nothing to measure, just a story that could be mocked or believed according to the listener's hunger. Jace felt no urge to defend it. The thing that needed keeping didn't depend on being proved. He turned and carried the branch inside. The door clicked shut on a room that felt somehow larger than it had at dawn. He set the token on the mantel above the stove where the heat could coax out whatever scent lived in such wood. For a moment he stood with his hand on it, steady as a brand on a flank. Then he stepped back and let the firelight climb its length. Outside, a light wind brushed the eaves, almost tender. Inside, the two small blankets on the floor were empty now, creased in the shapes they had learned overnight, evidence that warmth had done its work and would be asked for again somewhere beyond sight. Jace's chest filled and eased. He was not less alone in the simple count of bodies, but the kind of alone had changed. The valley had seen him keep something alive, and the valley, or what lived old in it, had said thank you in the only way it trusted. In that exchange, a boundary had been drawn and blessed, not a wall, a line made of respect. The kind that lets a man sleep with his door unbarred and his coffee set for two, just in case gratitude finds its way back on another gray morning and asks to warm itself by his fire. Part 4. Winter's Rest and Suspicion. Winter's Rest woke to a clatter of hooves on packed snow and the thin peal of a church bell stitching morning to habit. The main street lay in a bright hush, storefronts frosted to the eaves, a few wagon wheels creaking as teamsters coaxed their rigs past the saloon and the feed store. At the far end, the one-room schoolhouse wore a roofline of white, so even it looked painted on. Breath plumed from every living thing the town itself seemed to exhale. Inside the Buckhorn bar, coffee outnumbered whiskey. Men hunched over the scarred counter, warming hands on tin mugs, trading the weather back and forth like a coin. Word had come in early from the north pasture. The rancher up on Pinyon Draw had taken something strange into his cabin and come out with stranger eyes. By the time Sheriff Tom Calder pushed through the doors, the tale had grown a pelt and a pair of shadows. Calder was a square-shouldered man whose hat brim cut a straight line through rumor. He listened because that was his job, not because he liked stories. Quarry cats don't stand 8 feet, someone said. Not unless they walk on each other's shoulders. Laughter, then, the kind that skids and falls quiet when the law is present. Calder's eyes were made of that particular patience men use when deciding whether a thing is nonsense or danger. He set his mug down, untasted. They found Jace Walker outside the general store, a sack of flour over one shoulder, the other shoulder, carrying the kind of silence that doesn't invite company. Snow squeaked under boots as the small cluster closed in Calder, a pair of deputies, 2 ranch hands who'd ridden down just to see what a man's face looks like after he's seen a myth. "You've got folks spooked," Calder said, voice even. "Tell me what you saw." Jace shifted the sack to the other side, met the sheriff's gaze without challenge. He didn't give the street a story. He reached into his coat and drew out the carved branch, the satin-smooth wood catching a sliver of winter sun. The teardrop mark held its quiet among the chatter of frost. "What am I looking at?" Calder asked. An answer Jace said. It was all he had and enough. From the schoolhouse steps, Lila Hart crossed the street, scarf tight at her throat, chalk still dusting the fingers that curled around her shawl. Widowhood had taught her the economy of words and the weight of listening. She stopped beside Jace's eyes on the branch, as if it were a page in a book no one else had learned to read. She laid her palm on the wood the way one settles a nervous colt. "There are stories," she said softly, "that only want to be left alone." It wasn't a rebuke. It was a mercy offered to Jace, to the sheriff, to the town. Calder's jaw worked as if weighing the sentence in his teeth. He looked past them toward the line of pines that fenced the north. His job was to walk toward things other people walked away from. "Show me where," he said finally. Jace held his breath long enough to feel the vow from last night burn through his ribs again. He nodded once. The little party gathered without cheer, Calder, 2 deputies, the pair of ranch hands, and Jace. Lila stood in the street until they mounted, her hand still warm from the branch. The forest took them with the sound of leather and snow. Under the trees, the world dimmed to a cathedral gray light filtered through iced needles. It didn't take long to reach the clearing near Jace's cabin. Calder swung down, squinted at the sweep of white, then pointed. There, just there, a path had been pressed into the crust, broad and shallow, as if a column had passed, careful and light. It led away toward the deeper timber, a suggestion more than a line. The deputies stepped off the trail to keep from scarring it. The ranch hands leaned to study its edges, breath loud in the hush. Then, with no wind to help and no hand at work, the path softened. The neat pressed ovals relaxed. Edges feathered. The pale groove that had invited was erased a finger width at a time, as if the snow had remembered it preferred being whole. Calder watched it vanish the way a witness watches a crucial letter dissolve in water. "Tracks don't do that," one deputy muttered. "Some do," Jace said, not looking away. What rose then wasn't panic. It was a pressure, the fear that men with tools and certainty might break a boundary that had held because nobody knew where to push. Calder's eyes went to the carved branch tucked into Jace's saddle scabbard. He blew a breath that smoked the air and thought about how law works best when it knows when to stop. He holstered his questions. "Nothing to chase," he said at last. "We head back." They turned their horses toward winter's rest. The trees closed ranks behind them with no sound at all, as if a door had been shut gently on a room that wished to remain unlit. And Jace felt under the familiar ache of being misbelieved the prickling relief that the forest itself had kept the Pact from human hands. Part 5. Trial by Fire and the Final Pact. Twilight folded the valley into a single soft color. At the forest's edge the wind had stilled, and snow, having said its piece, simply rested. Hooves and boots made the only marks on the pale ground as Sheriff Tom Calder paced a tight half-moon and worked with gloved precision a sprung steel trap here, a baited haunch there, stakes tamped in with the flat of a hatchet. Iron glinted where the last of day brushed it. "Law's not a dare," Jace said, voice low. "It's a line. And the night you're chasing, they never crossed it." Calder didn't look up. Men get skittish when something bigger than their stories walks past their porch. They walked past, Jace said. That's the point. Lila Hart stood with Jace, scarf dark against the pinking dusk, hands folded tight around themselves, as if holding a prayer steady. She offered neither lecture nor plea, only presence, the kind that leans a moment toward mercy and makes it easier to choose. From the timber, a rumble unspooled deep, measured not threat so much as announcement. The tree line composed itself into shifting height, a shoulder here, a head there, a hint of arm and breath. The shadows didn't enter the meadow. They arrived without crossing the way a tide arrives, even when you cannot see the sea. Calder's hand found the butt of his revolver by habit. Jace stepped forward into the empty space between men and myth and set the carved branch down on the snow. The teardrop mark stared up like a small moon. He took 3 steps back, palms open, and the gesture made the traps look suddenly loud and foolish. The rumble steadied. Elder Ash resolved from the gray 8 feet of deliberate calm breath, clouding in slow engines. He stopped at a distance that said, "We remember what you did. We also remember the edge of things." Jace answered without a word, chin lowered, eyes level. Then the hush found its true center. From behind Elder Ash, one of the small ones, fur tidied by sleep and warmth, eyes glossy with a child's new courage, stepped forward. It walked the way the very young do after sickness, careful, proud. At the boundary it halted, looked from Jace to Lila to the sheriff, and then raised a 5-fingered hand high. Not a wave. A mirror held up to the human gesture it had learned in a room of fire and wool. Lila's breath hitched. She didn't cry out. She softened the way snow receives a falling thing. Her eyes shone like water that has chosen not to freeze. Jace lifted his own hand in answer. Palm outward, no claim, no call, just recognition in the simplest script the world owns. Elder Ash stepped close enough to lay an arm around the small one's shoulders and draw it gently back into the shelter of his chest. Then he reached to a thong at his side and brought out a wooden charm no larger than a matchbox, smoothed thin its face, carved with 2 parallel lines. He came forward, 3 deliberate paces, knelt, and set the charm beside the branch. 2 signs, 2 sentences. A grammar of boundary and gratitude. The meadow didn't move. It listened. Calder's thumb eased off the hammer he hadn't meant to cock. He stared at the charm as if it were a ledge he could choose to step down onto. The muscle in his jaw stopped working. He lowered the revolver until the barrel pointed at the snow, and then with a breath that showed in the cooling air, he holstered the gun. "Not tonight," he said almost to himself. For a count of heartbeats, men and legends regarded one another the way neighbors do when they decide a fence is not an insult, but an understanding. Elder Ash inclined his head. Jace matched it. Lila placed her palm over her scarf, steadying her own breathing to the slow machinery of the giant's exhale. The forest accepted the moment into its ledger. The tribe withdrew as they always had, without claim or clatter, returning to depth until trees stitched them from sight. The meadow widened by an inch you could feel but not measure. Calder stepped forward, broke 2 traps from their stakes, and folded them closed with a grimace that might one day be called humility. Jace knelt, lifted the parallel-marked charm, and set it gently against the carved branch. "A boundary blessed," he said. Lila's fingers brushed the tokens, reverent as touching a relic. Then let it stand. They turned home in the blue hour, leaving no argument behind. Only iron unmade, a promise in wood, and a strip of snow, where silence lay like a trust between worlds. Peace before sleep night settles like a quilt over the cabin. The fire has gentled to coals. Beyond the window, snow drifts in slow, floating flakes, unhurried as resting breath. Jace stands at the hearth and lifts the 2 wooden tokens, the dead of warmth branch and the peace border charm, and hangs them side by side on the mantel. The stove ticks softly, approving. A light knock, neighborly, not urgent. Lila steps in with a small loaf still steaming in a cloth. They sit with few words, chairs angled toward the stove. The quiet between them, spacious and kind. Wind combs the eaves in long strokes. The room carries a faint scent of pine wool and bread. Jace looks at the tokens, then at the firelight trembling along their edges. He whispers almost to the room itself, "Maybe loneliness isn't meant to be erased, but to be shared." The music thins to the hush of embers. The camera lingers on the flame reflected in carved wood. 2 signs, 2 promises hinting at other western nights ahead. A veiled woman on the road, an orphan, with a map, a relic buried where no map will hold. But not tonight. Tonight is peace. If this story touched you, leave a number from 0 to 10. See you on the next journey, where a lone rancher steps again into the legendary woods, and together we move from surprise to healing.